around you. And then maybe 1 or 2 minutes, just very quickly, on that question. Don't have to, we'll have lots of opportunities to talk, so don't feel you have to say everything right now, but 2 or 3 minutes to talk together. Okay, shall we just come back together as a whole group? And it's great. This group is actually small enough that we can talk and hear each other. So, anybody just want to say 1 or 2 things that you were talking about together there?
We spent most of our time introducing ourselves.
Good. That was the most important thing. Well done.
But the only other comment was I'm only really probably conscious of gender if the passage is about, that you're describing is about women. You feel, well, as a man, maybe I don't quite get it fully.
Yeah, that's really, yes. So as a man, maybe I don't quite get, yes. If the passage is particularly, that's what you're being asked to preach on. Thank you. We'll come back to that a bit later. Any other thoughts or comments at this point?
We were recognising the importance of context. I stood up to preach in this building probably as the first woman who was preaching in this building, with just always men preachers.
Yes.
Very hard not to be conscious at that point.
Yes, yeah, fantastic.
But now, no, so I think context and your congregation's expectations.
Yeah, thank you. So sometimes you are really aware of your gender for various reasons, but maybe not all the time. Yeah, thank you. Any other thoughts? Yeah?
I said I'll be preaching for 28 years, but maybe it's because I'm just very self-conscious, but I think I am constantly aware of my gender.
Thank you. Yeah, that's good. And it depends where we are, it depends our context, about different denominations of different positions on preaching, and we'll come and look at some of that. And so there might be various reasons why we are or aren't conscious on any particular day of our gender and other characteristics that we bring to preaching. So it is all too easy, I think, to slip into generalizations, to say a woman is bound to be more empathetic, a woman is more inclined to tell stories, a woman maybe is more in touch with feelings. These are some of the things you hear. I don't know whether those are true for you or not. We'll come on to that. But there's a bit of research that's been done by Cheryl J. Sanders, who's a professor and scholar in Christian ethics. And she did some research into this, into sermons from the Black Pentecostal tradition, the difference between women and men's sermons. And she found that women and men's sermons were more alike than they were different. So that she found no difference in the form the sermon took. So women were not inclined to preach more narrative sermons and men more expository sermons, she found. The choice of biblical texts was pretty standard across women and men. The themes of the sermons didn't differ hugely, but she did find a slight difference in some of the tools that women and men tended to use. She did find that women were slightly more inclined to tell stories and to bring in personal testimony than men in that particular tradition. And her conclusion was that women and men generally preach the same sermons, but with different accents. And I quite like that. We say the same things, but we bring to it something that is our own accent, perhaps as women and men. So I wonder if when we talk about women and men preaching, there are kind of 2 dangers. There's the danger of overplaying the differences and the danger of underplaying the differences. So if we overplay what it is like to preach as a woman or a man, we might reduce ourselves simply to our gender and miss all of the other distinctives that we bring to preaching, such as upbringing, background, theological standpoint, individual personality. So not all the women in this room and not all the men in this room will preach in the same way. So I'm sometimes told that my preaching style is quite male, and every time I do, I want to do this. I'm a teacher by background. I like logical argument. I like to give clear points in the way that I approach things. My husband, who is also ordained and a preacher, tends to be much less structured in his sermons. He tells far more stories and he cries at the drop of a hat, honestly. So, you know, what's that about? Are we male, or we're mixing it up there in terms of what's male and what's female? Are we preaching as male and female, or as Emma and Matt? But on the other hand, if we underplay the differences, I do think if we just say, well, we're all the same, you know, there's no difference, we might miss some of the distinctiveness that women bring to preaching in particular. My experience as a woman, as I approach and interpret and preach scripture, I do that as a woman, and I bring all that I am to that, and part of who I am is a woman, and that's a really important thing. So we're going to try and navigate that slightly tricky tightrope as we go through today. So to explore this subject of preaching as a woman, I'm going to do what might be called a stereotypically female thing to do, and use a story. And the story I want to use is the story of Mary approaching the tomb on that first Easter Sunday that we find in John 20. She expected to find one thing, and she found something different. So let's imagine, if you like, that the resurrection is, if you like, a text to be discovered and encountered and understood. How did Mary read the text? And how did Mary preach the text? So let's just think about it. You may be thinking, oh, how does this work? But let's unpack that a little bit. So the first thing is approaching the text. So early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed. Now, early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, is quite a good description, I think, of setting out on the process of writing a sermon. So there's something about coming to the text, isn't there, quietly, before everything becomes too hectic, before the clamour starts, before the day starts, metaphorically. Many women I know, and some men, and I'm always going to be doing that, think about the sermon well before it is due to be preached. Now, I spend a lot of time interviewing for vicar's posts in my patch. And one of the questions I always ask is, how do you prepare your sermons? You can tell an awful lot when you ask somebody that question. And the answers are really fascinating. And actually, I've learned loads. I'm partly asking it out of selfish reasons, because I think, oh, that's good, I'll nick that. Many people speak about coming to the text on a Monday, so the day after you've preached the preceding week's sermon, and sitting with it through the following days. I mean, maybe they actually prepare their sermon at 11:30 on a Sunday night, but they're just wanting to impress the bishop, you know, in what they're saying in their answer. But I don't know how you do this. I tend to, if I know what I'm preaching on, I tend to open a document that says, you know, the sermon for that week or that church. I travel around, I preach in a different church every Sunday, at least one. And so on my computer, I've got just a file that says sermons, and I line up all of the sermons I know I'm going to preach. Sometimes there's sort of 8 to 10 folders open there. And I just put the title, and I put the reading that I'm going to be preaching on, and I just throw things, they're like buckets that I think, oh yeah, that will be interesting for that sermon, and I just throw it in, so I kind of get them lined up. And then I obviously don't finish it, sometimes till 11:30 on the Sunday night before, but I start early on. I wonder how you do that. So I wonder how you feel when you first read the text that you're going to be preaching on. And I'm assuming for this session that we are all going to be preaching on a text. If we're not, maybe we need another kind of conference, but there will be a text somewhere in what we're preaching. So do you feel apprehensive? Do you feel excited? Do you feel fearful? Do you feel curious? When you first think, oh, what does that text say? Mary approached the tomb in the dark. She thought she knew what she would find, a dead body waiting to be anointed, but that's not what she encountered. And it can be a bit like that when it comes to preaching. We come to the text maybe expecting one thing, and it surprises us with something else. So that's why I like to live with the text for as long as I can. I like to mull it over. And often the thoughts for my sermon come when I'm in the shower, or when I'm walking the dog, or when I'm not deliberately trying to think about it at all. So I like to get to know the text, become familiar with it. And I don't know if this is a particularly female thing to do, but I like to talk about it. I wonder if it's a bit like, I've heard several women speak of it, a bit like a pregnancy. You know, in the early phase, I hold the text somewhere in my inmost place, as the psalmist would have it, where it's growing and forming, but not yet ready to be born, and the Spirit is feeding it. That pregnancy and birth metaphor isn't a new one. Calvin, who probably would have taken a fairly dim view of women preaching, but in a sermon on 1 Timothy 4, 6-7, said that preachers are a bit like wet nurses. You know, they nurture this baby. So a bit like a newly expectant mother in those early days of living with the text, I tend to tell everyone about it, especially my long-suffering husband. And I wonder how that is for you. Do you ever involve others in your sermon preparation? So I had a lovely example of this the other day. I was interviewing a potential ordinand, somebody who might come and train for ministry, and I was talking to her about her life and what she does, and she mentioned to me this was the week before Ascension Day. And I said, oh, what are you doing on Ascension Day? And she said, oh, I'm preaching. And I said, oh, what's your text? And she told me. And we ended up having this really brilliant conversation. She told me that she was going to use, it was for young people, she was going to use the film Up. Have you seen the film Up? You know, that was going to be, she was going to show clips from that, and it was all about how Jesus went up. And I said to her, well, there's a really great commentary. Willie James Jennings has written a brilliant commentary on Acts, and he's got this amazing quote, how Jesus went up so the Spirit could come down. And she was like, oh, great, I must look that up. And we ended up having this brilliant kind of sharing of what we were going to preach our sermons on. I like to think of this as the homiletical equivalent of a baby shower. You know, where I kind of tell people, this sermon is about to be born. Do you want to help me with it? So I wonder how that is for you. Let's just take a moment. How do you prepare? And do you ever see preaching as a communal activity? So again, just with those people around you, a couple of minutes on that. How do you prepare? And do you ever talk about it with others? 2 or 3 minutes, and then we'll gather back together. Okay, shall we come back together with some of those thoughts? It's great. So what have you been saying together? I mean, particularly maybe about this, well, either some top tips on how to prepare sermons, although I think we've got 2 really good sessions coming up on that, so we might explore, lean into that a bit more. But what about this question about communal preaching or sharing what we're preaching on? Anybody got any examples or thoughts or ways that you do that? Maybe in some of your churches you might have systematic ways of doing this. I think it's quite rare, but if you do, I'd love to hear that. Should we go there and then over here? Yeah.
I started preaching when I have a almost there, speaking it to my husband, who's a lecturer. And so originally what I was looking at was technique, I think, more than anything. But as that's been going on, we've actually started discussing what it is that I've written rather than just the way that I've said it. So that's the sort of nearest thing I come to.
Yeah.
But it's been quite a treasure really to move from that how you do it to what's interesting.
So having that discussion about what you're saying, it's really precious, isn't it? And I guess it also depends on what kind of processor we are. You know, I cannot have a thought unless it happens outside of my face. So I really need to talk about it. Other people are much more, well, no, I just need to mull this over internally. But how about you, sir?
Well, I say I do a lot of cycling, and the guys I cycle with, most of whom are not Christians, they know that I'm a Christian and preach and so forth. So sometimes they'll say, oh, are you preaching on Sunday? What are you preaching? You know, and that sort of thing. Which leads to some bizarre conversations sometimes. One guy who said, have you ever tried using AI to create a sermon? And things like that. And he sent me examples of one.
No. Thank you. That's really great, isn't it? When you get people who are not necessarily in the church or, not completely versed in the things that we are to get some comments. I'd love to. That's great. Fascinating. Any other thoughts on this? Do any of you have any sort of shared things in your churches? Some churches have sort of post-sermon analysis, but I don't know, you hear less about pre-sermon sharing. Yeah.
For me, there's a tension at being a pastor of the church from this sense of responsibility that I have of telling the story of this people of God and how others might speak into that telling the story that you might do from preaching. So communal preaching is, feels risky. Because are they going to tell a story that I agree with, that I see as well? So, but I think it's important to do, but I feel the tension of it and the risk.
It is risky, and it needs to be, it needs to be a safe place, doesn't it? It needs to be somewhere that you can have those sort of conversations. It wouldn't be right to say to the whole congregation, well, I'm thinking of preaching this next Sunday, what do you all think? But there are maybe places where we can have a bit more of that honest conversation. Well, store up those thoughts. We'll come back to some more discussion in a minute. But I just wanted to sort of push into this point of Mary coming to the tomb with a sense of fear and anxiety. And I wonder when we approach preaching, there might be various fears that we come with and that we need to acknowledge and recognize. And maybe particularly this is something that relates a bit more to women. So firstly, I wonder if there is sometimes just a fear of preaching itself. Never mind the awesome responsibility as doing what you've just said, which is telling the story of God and this community. Every time I stand up, I feel the weight of that. But I wonder if there is the fear of preaching. We kind of have in our minds the thing we often hear, that preaching is not a good way of communicating. People can't concentrate for any more than 3 minutes, And we sort of think, is this okay? Is this thing that I'm doing? Which is why I'm so glad there's a day like this, because we can really look at this and say, yes, this is an important thing, but maybe that's one of those fears. There is often the fear of preaching as a woman. And I felt this throughout my ministry. I've often been the first to preach in spaces, as you've described. I'm the first female Bishop of Kensington, and sometimes when I stand up to preach, I think, well, I not only have to do a good job as me, but I have to do a really good job as a woman, because if I don't, I'm letting down the whole of my sisterhood. That is that sometimes can be a pressure. It depends on the context that you're in. I have ringing in my ears one of my favourite quotes, just because it's so preposterous, a quote from Samuel Johnson, who said, "Sir, a woman's preaching is like a dog's walking on its hind legs. It is not done well, but you're surprised to find it done at all." Thanks, Samuel. Out the door. But, maybe not like that. But that there might be people who have a view that women shouldn't be preaching. And there may be, we may have different views on that. And so there is always that fear. How will my preaching be received as a woman? And then thirdly, I think there is this fear of what the text might hold. And I think actually if we don't have a healthy fear of what the text might hold, we probably shouldn't be preaching it. There is a right sense, isn't there, of awe and fear that we are handling the holy word of God. I wonder if there is a particular nervousness about that, though, around some of the texts. Sometimes we are asked to preach texts, I'm asked to preach texts as a woman, that are more problematic. It reminds me, before I was Bishop of Kensington, I worked for the Archbishop of Canterbury. So I lived and worked at Lambeth Palace. I can tell you all about that in the lunch break if you want to. But he tells a great story of one day, and this often happens, he'd invited the Prime Minister to come to Lambeth Palace and spend some time and have a meeting with him and gather with him in the chapel for evening prayer. So he sat there, in the chapel with some of the staff of Lambeth Palace, and he hadn't looked at the lectionary. And the lectionary reading, you can probably predict. So he sits there with Theresa May sitting in front of him. 1 Timothy 2, verse 12, I do not permit a woman to preach or to have authority over a man. And apparently Theresa May just very, very kindly just went like that. And then they carried on. So there is, as a preacher who is female, I firmly believe that the Bible is liberating for women and for men and for all of us. But sometimes we do need to wrestle with it and continue to wrestle until we have received a blessing. Mary's first approach to the tomb caused her to weep. And sometimes the Bible can do that to us. But like Mary, we mustn't settle for those tears without expecting the text to reveal some liberating answers. So that's the first thing. And the second two will be much quicker. Understanding the text. So she ran and went to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved, and said to them, they've taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they've laid him. So faced with the fact of the empty tomb and her fear and her panic, Mary did not understand what she was reading. And her first reaction was to go and call her brothers to help her, to run to Peter and John. And as a woman encountering the text for preaching, it is all too easy for me to run and fetch my brothers too quickly. So I can readily experience a crisis of confidence for all the reasons that we've just mentioned, and then I'm inclined to panic and run to the internet in my worst moments, commentaries in my better moments for advice. Don't hear me wrong, commentaries, and I'm sure we will talk about this, are absolutely indispensable for preachers, and I do not preach a text without having looked at least 2 commentaries. But I do need to also approach the text for myself and live with it for myself. And sometimes I think if I too quickly go to what others have said about that text, I might crowd out the quiet voice of the Spirit coming to speak to me for this sermon at this time. And I think it's worth taking note of the little detail that when Mary went to the tomb, she bent over. She had to bend low to get into the tomb. As she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb. We do come to the text with a sense of humility. But then Mary engages in this process of questioning with the angels, who are sat at the tomb. I thought I was going to see this. Where is he? What's happening? And she does this process of wrestling with the fact of the resurrection. So when we approach the Bible text to prepare for preaching, what is it that we might be bringing particularly to the text as women? Well, here we are. This is the bit with the angels. They said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping?" She said to them, "They've taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they have laid him." So what is the approach? What is the standpoint that we particularly bring as women? So first of all, I think we bring the perspective of living in a woman's body. I know what it is like to have the body of a woman. I do not know what it is like to have the body of a man. And I will bring that to my reading of the text. So, for example, if I'm preaching on the woman who has suffered a hemorrhage, I can identify that in a way that a man will not be able to. There will be other texts that I can't identify with living from the perspective as a woman. Added to this, I bring the perspective of my standpoint as a woman. That means that as I read a Bible text, I might have sympathy for the women in the text. It doesn't mean that I will identify with all women in all Bible texts. At this stage in my life, I do not know what it is like to be as old as Anna, or I don't know what it's like to be childless, for example, like Hannah. It's not that all women identify with all women. But as a woman, perhaps I am more likely to see the standpoint of the women in the stories, just as someone who is unemployed or living in a war zone or disabled or a refugee will notice the things in the text that relate to their lived experience. So when I read the narrative of the birth of Jesus, I might be more inclined to see myself standing next to Mary than to Joseph. I might picture myself in the bathroom with Bathsheba rather than on the roof with David. I once heard a really brilliant series of expositions on the story of Ruth by a husband and wife team. And they spoke about the love story of Ruth and Boaz, and it became like a soap opera. It was while I was at Trinity College, and the students were like queuing up to hear the next installment in this exciting drama as this couple unveiled it together. So I might bring to the process of wrestling with the text from the perspective of being female. So I can't get away from the fact that Jesus, and I wouldn't want to, was male and therefore different to me. So I might react to Jesus' stories in a different way to the way a man would. I once heard a sermon on the woman who anointed Jesus' feet. And the preacher was extolling that woman's extravagant expression of worship and passion and love for Jesus. And I caught myself thinking quite negative thoughts about this outrageously shameless woman. I found myself sitting there and thinking, yeah, well, she was an attention seeker, wasn't she? And actually being a little bit negative about her. So maybe I might be able to experience the text particularly as a female. I might be inclined to notice those texts where power lies against women. So one day when I was principal of Trinity College, we had a reading from Matthew 22, where the Pharisees questioned Jesus about what happens after the resurrection to a woman who has been passed on for marriage to each of 7 brothers. Who will she be married to after the resurrection? And the preacher spoke about the nature of marriage and the resurrection and the kind of doctrinal implications of it all. And all I could think of was that poor woman. No wonder she was dead after having 7 different husbands. So, as women, as men, we will bring slightly different perspectives to the text. Sometimes the text says to us, "Why are you weeping? This is not as bad as it looks." So I wonder, again, for discussion, what particularly do you wrestle with when you're preparing to preach? What does that process of questioning, Mary questioning the angels, what does that look like for you? How does that process of questioning the text work for you? And particularly as women, but also as men, perhaps particularly being aware of gender. So again, just for a couple of moments, we'll finish in 10 minutes or so, but just for 2 or 3 minutes, maybe try and speak to someone you've not spoken to already. So if you've turned to one side, turn to the other, or if you've turned to the back, turn to the front, if that works. If you need to move, I'm sure we can just move seats for a moment or two, but let's have a bit of a discussion about this process of wrestling with the text, if that's all right. Okay. Again, shall we gather back together? Again, so sorry to cut into what I'm sure are really good conversations. We can carry on over coffee, and we've got lunch, we've got the whole day together, so we can keep talking. But any gems that have come out from what you've been saying to each other, or anything you've heard from somebody else that you think, oh, that happens to me too, or that's a good idea, or anything to feed in? There's lots of talking and lots of gesturing,
I'll go first. I recently had to preach on the fruits of the Spirit, Galatians 5. I'm preaching into the context I'm in now. I kind of knew what the issues were with some of the people, so that was really hard. I would say that it really weighed heavily on me. And I had to preach part 2, learning how part 1 landed. And lots of people gave good feedback. There was a couple of people who were quiet and weren't so happy about it. And so, wrestling with, okay, well, preach it now, preach it later. And in the end, it was one of the deacons who said, you promised us part 2, so I preached it. So it wasn't as painful as I thought. But yeah, just about knowing what's in the text and how it might land and how it might impact people and being faithful to the text
such an important thing, isn't it? When you know the community, and as it absolutely should be, and you know all of the issues that are going on and how they might land in what you're preaching. It reminds me, I love that story of somebody, a pastor who once preached on, there's a really difficult pastoral situation going on in their church, and they thought, right, I just need to address this head on, you know, and I'm going to preach. I can't remember the text, but, you know, it's pointed, everybody will know it's about this pastoral situation. And as they were going, they were standing at the door and everybody was shaking hands, and one of the people for whom was involved in this pastoral situation, and the vicar thought, oh dear, you know, here they come, I wonder what they're going to say. And they shook the pastor's hand and said, Pastor, that was a brilliant sermon. It's such a shame that the person who it was about wasn't here to hear what you had to say. So you never quite know how it's going to land. But yeah, that wrestle of the text and the community together. Yeah, thank you.
I think we talked a little bit about that, how you can either see it as easier to preach to people you don't know, or easier to preach to people you do know, and then the idea of whether you're going to offend and whether you're there to offend, whether Scripture's offensive, or whether we need to try to present it in a way that's more palatable for people to hear. And I must say that as a woman, I'm definitely not naturally empathetic. It's been the difficulties of life that have made me a bit more empathetic.
Yeah. So that that thing, preaching as an ultimate pastoral task. Yeah, and how we do that. Thank you. Any other?
Something else that's kind of connected to that is when you're preaching kind of into not necessarily a tough pastoral situation, but knowing people's situations from a pastoral perspective. So, for example, preaching on Mother's Day, or preaching about healing, and you've got people in your congregation who haven't been healed and stuff like that. So it's kind of finding things in the text that are going to be really encouraging and liberating, but being really honest about this is quite painful as well, and how it works.
Yeah, and I love your word honest, you know, and how honest, you know, sometimes just saying, this is really hard, you know, and this text is really hard, and this text makes me angry, but there it is in God's word, you know, I think that's an important thing. Yeah, one of the things at the moment as a bishop, I preach in a different church every Sunday, and I don't know the people in front of me. And sometimes that's great. That's very liberating, because you think, well, I don't know, I can just so on. But I do really miss that sense of preaching in community and knowing the flock. Yeah. Right. Well, we'll just have the last chunk, and then we'll come back to discussions, I'm sure, later. So I think, you know, when I'm preparing a sermon, there's often, I don't know how it is for you, but there is this moment where you go, I have a sermon. It's okay, I have something to preach. Sometimes that will happen like 3 minutes before I'm due to stand up and preach it. So just as Mary worked through that process of weeping at the tomb, seeing Jesus there without recognizing him, and then seeing him for who he is, there is that moment, isn't it, when God calls your name and you think, I have a text to preach. So just really quickly, I realize it is coffee time, so we'll just 2 or 3 minutes on preaching the text, and really quickly. In Matthew's account of this story, we're told that Mary went with fear and great joy. She went with fear and great joy. What a wonderful way of describing preaching. You know, we stand up in the pulpit with fear and great joy. There's a great sense of joy that I have a message to deliver, coupled with that ever-present fear that I may not do it justice. Mary went to tell the disciples that she had seen the Lord, and she did it as herself. You know, this was Mary with all of her background, with all of her relationship with Jesus, with who they were together, saying, I have seen the Lord. And so it's too obvious to state, but we bring to our preaching our own experiences, who we are, who the Lord has been to us as women and as men. So likewise, I can bring to my sermon stories about the challenges and joys of being a mother, the challenges and joys of being a bishop, work-life balance, about what it's like to live as a woman in my culture and my society today. And when I do that, perhaps I am more likely to connect with some of the people in the congregation who have similar experiences. Perhaps I need to speak audibly into the lives of women, and male preachers can do the same. And I wonder if we just need to be careful of using women as men as well as men. Be careful to use women as well as men as examples and illustrations in our sermons. So when we talk about the heroes of faith, do we name Sarah and Miriam as well as Abraham and Moses? When we're telling inspiring stories of faith, do we mention Josephine Butler as well as William Wilberforce? You know, who are the people that we use as examples? Jesus used women as examples and points of reference in his stories a lot, which would have come as a great shock, I think, to some of those to whom he was speaking. So Mary went and announced the news of the resurrection, and I wonder what her voice was like in that moment. You know, she'd just run, so she was probably quite out of breath. Was she barely able to string a sentence together? And I think it's really important that we find our voice as women preachers. And at one level, this means preaching with our physical voices that are different to the voices of men. And you mentioned, I've also had the experience, sometimes I know I have been the first woman to preach in a certain context. And I really feel that. It's almost a spiritual thing. I find it really moving that, you know, these walls might not have heard a woman's voice preaching in this way before. And it's somehow as if my voice fills the space in a new way. But finding your voice obviously doesn't just only mean your vocal cords. It means who you are, who we are as preachers, yourself, your life, your story. I was listening to a really well-known female preacher the other day, and if I were to say her name, many of you would recognize it, but she was speaking to a small group, she told us that she felt she had only just begun to find her voice in preaching. And she's been preaching for, 20, 30 years. So, so this is a lifelong task. So will we as women and as men have the courage to find and preach with our own authentic voices? This is maybe something you can discuss over coffee. What do you bring to your preaching? And how do you preach as yourself? So that voice will sound different for each of us, but above all, it is the voice that proclaims, I have seen the Lord, and we go and tell others what he said to us. Thank you very much. Have a great coffee time.
Can you hear me? Let's go and have coffee and tea and chat over coffee, and then we'll come back and pick up one or two things before we go into Peter's session. So just go back to the same place where we were when you arrived, and we'll come back here for around about 11:30. Okay?